Sometimes the most valuable treasures are found by those who've lost everything else. The rain drummed against the corrugated metal roof of the abandoned storage facility on Southeast Industrial Boulevard, where Marcus Thorne pressed his weathered hands against the rusty lock of Unit 47. 3 months living rough had taught the former art expert which locks yielded to pressure and which buildings offered sanctuary from Portland's relentless autumn storms. His Harvard Ph.D. meant nothing now, not since the forgery scandal destroyed his marriage, his career, and his faith in the art world that had been his life's passion. The crate he pried open should have contained old furniture or forgotten Christmas decorations. Instead, wrapped in oiled canvas and Nazi documentation, lay a painting that made his breath catch in his throat. Even in the dim light filtering through grimy windows, Marcus recognized the unmistakable hand of Caravaggio, the dramatic chiaroscuro, the haunting expression of St. Catherine, the very work he'd been hired to authenticate 15 years ago. The same painting that had cost him everything when he'd declared it authentic, only to watch his career crumble when the real version surfaced at the Met. Which one was the forgery? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus's knees buckled, sending him stumbling backward into the maze of forgotten storage units. The painting remained propped against the opened crate, St. Catherine's eyes seeming to follow him through the gloom. 15 years collapsed into this moment, the heated arguments with museum directors, the sleepless nights poring over brushstroke analyses, the final humiliating press conference where his professional reputation died under camera flashes and accusations. He'd staked everything on that authentication. The painting had appeared through a private dealer, provenance murky but not impossible. Marcus had spent 6 months with it, studying every crack in the varnish, every layer of paint beneath his microscope. The composition, the technique, the very soul of the work, everything screamed Caravaggio. When he'd signed his authentication report, Marcus had been certain he was validating one of the master's lost works. Then, the Metropolitan Museum announced their acquisition of the Weeping Saint just weeks later. Same subject, same composition, ironclad provenance, tracing back to a Roman cardinal's collection. Marcus had flown to New York, demanded to see it, and found himself staring at what appeared to be an identical painting. The Met's version had better documentation, cleaner restoration, and the backing of the art world's most respected institutions. His painting became the fake overnight. His reputation followed. Now, crouched in this forgotten storage unit, Marcus forced himself to approach the canvas again. His hands, calloused from 3 months of digging through dumpsters and sleeping on concrete, trembled as he lifted it toward the weak afternoon light. The Nazi documentation scattered to the floor, shipping manifests dated 1943, inventory lists in precise German script, and a letter bearing Heinrich Brennan's signature. Heinrich Brennan. Marcus had heard whispers of the name in graduate school, a mid-level Nazi administrator who'd overseen cultural acquisitions in occupied Italy. Most of his stolen collection had been recovered after the war, returned to museums and private owners. But some pieces had vanished into the chaos of 1945. This was supposed to be one of them. Marcus studied the painting's edges, where Caravaggio's distinctive ground preparation showed through centuries-old cracks. He'd documented these exact flaws 15 years ago, photographed them, included them in his authentication report. Unless someone had created the world's most sophisticated forgery, matching not just the surface image but the underlying structure, the aging patterns, even the wooden panel's grain. This was the same painting he'd examined in 2008, which meant the version hanging in the Met was the fraud. Or worse, someone had deliberately orchestrated his downfall. The storage facility creaked around him as wind drove rain against its walls. Marcus had discovered this place during his first week on the streets, when sleeping in Pioneer Square had nearly gotten him arrested. The owner had abandoned the property to creditors, leaving dozens of units sealed but unguarded. Other homeless had found their way here too, claiming units like territories, but most avoided the deeper rows where Marcus had carved out his shelter in Unit 47. He'd chosen it for the electrical outlet that still worked, and the small window that provided light during the day. He'd never bothered with the locked units around him, until hunger had driven him to search for anything valuable enough to trade for food. His stomach reminded him why he'd started breaking into crates in the first place. 3 days since his last real meal, 2 since his last successful panhandling session. October in Portland meant fewer tourists, less sympathy, more competition from other homeless for the prime corners. His Harvard education couldn't teach him how to look pathetic enough to earn spare change, and his 3-piece suits had long since been traded for the army surplus jacket and torn jeans that now comprised his wardrobe. But holding $30 million of stolen art changed the equation entirely. Marcus carefully rewrapped the painting, his mind racing through possibilities. Returning it to authorities would require explanations he couldn't provide without revealing his breaking and entering. Claiming the reward would mean exposing himself to whoever had orchestrated the forgery at the Met, people powerful enough to destroy his career once who wouldn't hesitate to silence him permanently. Yet walking away meant letting the truth stay buried, while he slowly starved on Portland's streets. Thunder rolled overhead as Marcus made his decision. He lifted the painting and carried it deeper into his makeshift shelter, where cardboard and stolen tarps created a space barely large enough for his sleeping bag. Tomorrow he would need food, but tonight he would need answers. Somewhere in the documentation scattered around that crate lay the key to understanding how Heinrich Brennan's stolen masterpiece had become the weapon used to destroy Marcus Thorne's life, and perhaps, if he was clever enough to navigate the dangerous waters ahead, the same painting might offer him a chance at redemption. Or revenge. Outside, the storm intensified, but for the first time in months, Marcus felt warm. Dawn broke gray and unforgiving through the storage facility's grimy windows, pulling Marcus from the first decent sleep he'd managed in weeks. The Caravaggio lay beside him, wrapped in Heinrich Brennan's Nazi documentation, $30 million in stolen art-sharing space with his moldering sleeping bag, and the empty Vienna sausage cans that marked his recent meals. He'd spent half the night studying those German documents by the light of his dying phone, parsing shipping records and inventory lists until his eyes burned. The paper trail painted a clear picture. The painting had been looted from a Roman church in 1943, transported to Berlin, then disappeared in the chaos of Germany's collapse. Somehow it had ended up in Portland, sealed away in a storage unit that time forgot. Marcus stretched cramped muscles and checked his phone. 7:30 a.m. The Salvation Army served breakfast until 9, but only to those who'd stood in line since 7. He'd missed it again, which meant another day of strategic panhandling and dumpster diving behind the better restaurants in the Pearl District. The irony wasn't lost on him. Yesterday, he'd been calculating which downtown corners might yield enough spare change for a McDonald's value meal. Now he was guardian of a masterpiece worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. But touching that value meant exposing himself, and exposure meant confronting the forces that had already destroyed him once. Marcus carefully repositioned the painting behind a stack of water-damaged boxes, ensuring it remained hidden but accessible. His morning routine hadn't changed. It couldn't change, not without drawing the wrong kind of attention. 3 months on Portland's streets had taught him that survival meant invisibility, and invisibility required rigid adherence to the patterns that kept him alive. First stop, the Plaid Pantry 6 blocks north, where the morning shift manager occasionally let him use the bathroom without buying anything. Marcus had cultivated this small mercy by never causing trouble, always saying please and thank you, and leaving the facilities cleaner than he'd found them. Dignity, he'd learned, was a currency more valuable than quarters. The October morning bit through his army surplus jacket as he walked through neighborhoods he'd once admired during gallery openings and wine tastings. The converted warehouses and upscale lofts of the Pearl District had been his world before the scandal, a place where his expertise commanded respect and his opinions shaped purchasing decisions worth millions. Now those same streets offered only the possibility of loose change and the constant threat of police harassment. At the Plaid Pantry, Marcus nodded to Jerry, the manager who'd shown him kindness without pity. Morning. Storm knocked out power in half the building last night, Jerry said, not looking up from his inventory clipboard. Generator kept the coolers running, but I've got breakfast burritos that won't keep another day. You want one? It was charity disguised as practicality, the kind of grace that kept Marcus's faith in humanity from disappearing entirely. "I'd appreciate that." Jerry handed him a wrapped burrito still warm from the heat lamp. "Coffee's fresh too, if you want some." Marcus accepted both offerings, knowing that this moment of human decency was worth more than the Nazi treasure hidden in Unit 47. These small kindnesses were what he truly had to lose, the fragile network of relationships that made street life bearable. If his past caught up with him, if powerful enemies decided he knew too much, these innocent people might pay the price for their compassion. "Thank you," Marcus said, meaning it completely. "Stay dry out there. Weather's supposed to get worse." Outside, Marcus found his usual morning spot in Chapman Park, where he could eat in relative peace while observing the rhythms of a city waking up. Office workers hurried past with their expensive coffee and urgent phone calls, inhabiting the world he'd once belonged to. Sometimes he recognized faces from his former life, gallery owners, collectors, museum board members, who'd once sought his opinions and valued his expertise. They never recognized him. The transformation from respected professional to invisible homeless man was more complete than any disguise. 3 months of irregular meals had hollowed his cheeks, while weather and worry had aged him beyond his 58 years. The man who'd once lectured at universities and authenticated million-dollar acquisitions had vanished into America's vast population of discarded lives. But as Marcus bit into his breakfast burrito and watched Portland come alive around him, he felt the weight of possibility pressing against his chest. Hidden in that storage unit was proof of his destroyed reputation, evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the art world. The question wasn't whether he had the right to reclaim his former life. It was whether he had the courage to risk the small dignities that kept him human. The Caravaggio represented more than money or vindication. It was a choice between the safety of invisibility and the dangerous hope of resurrection. For the first time since his fall from grace, Marcus Thorne had something worth losing again. That terrified him more than poverty ever could. Marcus crushed the empty burrito wrapper, preparing to face another day of careful invisibility, when his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar sound, an actual call, not the usual spam that plagued his prepaid device. The number was blocked, but after 3 months of digital silence, any human contact felt significant enough to answer. "Hello? Dr. Thorne?" The voice was crisp, professional, with a faint European accent that made Marcus's chest tighten. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I represent certain interested parties in matters of recovered cultural property." Marcus stood abruptly, scanning the park for surveillance he couldn't identify but somehow felt. "I think you have the wrong number." "I don't believe I do. We know about your recent discovery, Marcus. May I call you Marcus?" The breakfast burrito turned to lead in his stomach. Less than 18 hours had passed since he'd opened Heinrich Brennan's crate, and already someone was tracking him. That suggested either extensive monitoring or inside information that reached back decades. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, but his voice betrayed him with its tremor. Unit 47 at the Cascade Storage Facility. Crate marked 1943, estate of H. Brennan. The Weeping Saint by Caravaggio, stolen from Santa Maria del Grassi in Rome, March 15, 1943. Shall I continue? Marcus's legs gave out, dropping him back onto the park bench. The level of detail was impossible unless they'd been watching him, but the storage facility had been empty, isolated. Unless they'd been watching him longer than that. Unless they'd been watching him since his fall from grace, waiting for this exact moment. "What do you want?" "A conversation. Nothing more threatening than that, I assure you. There's a coffee shop called Stumptown on 3rd Avenue. Meet me there in 1 hour. And if I don't, then you'll continue living on Portland streets while possessing information that could get you killed. The choice is yours, Marcus, but I suspect you're intelligent enough to recognize an opportunity when it presents itself." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone in the weak morning light. Around him, Portland's rhythm continued unchanged. Joggers passed through the park, early commuters hurried toward office buildings, the homeless camp under the Burnside Bridge stirred to reluctant life. But his world had shifted fundamentally in the span of a 30-second phone call. Someone knew about the painting. Someone had been waiting for him to find it. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. Elena Vasquez could represent the legitimate heirs seeking stolen Nazi loot. She might work for the shadowy network that had orchestrated his downfall 15 years ago. Or she could be connected to whoever had placed a forgery in the Metropolitan Museum while ensuring the authentic Caravaggio remained hidden and forgotten. Any of those scenarios meant danger, but they also meant something he'd lost months ago: relevance. For 3 months, Marcus had been nobody, a discarded man invisible to his former peers, noticed only by convenience store managers kind enough to offer expired food. The Elena Vasquez call proved that somewhere in the world's corridors of power, people still considered Dr. Marcus Thorne important enough to track, manipulate, and potentially eliminate. It was terrifying. It was also intoxicating. Marcus walked slowly toward downtown, weighing his options with each step. He could disappear deeper into Portland's homeless underground, abandon the painting, and hope Elena Vasquez lost interest. He could contact local authorities, report the stolen art, and hope the legal system protected him better than it had during his fraud case. Or he could meet this mysterious woman and discover what forces had shaped his destruction. The smart choice was obvious. 3 months of street wisdom screamed warnings about unknown callers making veiled threats. Every survival instinct he'd developed told him to run. But Marcus Thorne had spent 15 years wondering who had orchestrated his fall from grace. He'd endured professional humiliation, financial ruin, and social exile without ever understanding the true mechanisms of his destruction. The Caravaggio had given him a key to those answers, and Elena Vasquez might be the door. At Pioneer Square, Marcus stopped at the chess tables, where a few early players were setting up their boards. He'd occasionally watched their games, remembering when his biggest decisions involved authentication reports and lecture schedules, rather than which dumpsters might yield edible food. The players moved their pieces with careful deliberation, understanding that each choice created consequences that rippled through the entire game. Marcus checked his phone. 43 minutes until the meeting. For the first time since losing everything, he was about to make a move that mattered. Whether it led to checkmate or redemption remained to be seen, but the alternative, spending the rest of his life wondering what might have been, felt like a different kind of death. He turned toward 3rd Avenue, walking into whatever trap or opportunity Elena Vasquez represented. Behind him, the storage facility held $30 million in stolen art and decades of buried secrets. Ahead lay the most dangerous choice of his life. Marcus stopped halfway to 3rd Avenue, his feet refusing to carry him forward. The morning crowd flowed around him like water around a stone, commuters with purposeful strides, delivery drivers unloading trucks, street sweepers clearing yesterday's debris. All of them belonged to a world that operated by rules he understood, where actions led to predictable consequences. Elena Vasquez represented something else entirely. He ducked into the doorway of a closed vintage shop, pulling out his phone to stare at the blocked number that had upended his careful existence. His thumb hovered over the callback option, then moved to the power button. Turn off the phone, walk away, pretend the conversation never happened. In an hour, Elena Vasquez would sit alone at Stumptown Coffee, and eventually she'd realize that Dr. Marcus Thorne wasn't coming. But she'd already proven she could find him once. The weight of that knowledge settled into Marcus's bones like winter cold. 3 months of invisibility hadn't protected him at all. It had simply been an illusion while more powerful forces positioned their pieces. The storage facility, Unit 47, even his discovery of Heinrich Brennan's crate might have been orchestrated by people who'd been watching him far longer than he'd imagined. A police cruiser turned onto 3rd Avenue, and Marcus instinctively pressed deeper into the doorway. Officer Rodriguez had roused him twice last month, not unkindly, but with the firm suggestion that Pioneer Square wasn't suitable for extended loitering. The cops knew his face now, categorized him as one of the harmless ones who didn't cause trouble but couldn't be allowed to get too comfortable in the business district. That fragile tolerance would evaporate the moment his name appeared in police reports connected to stolen Nazi art. The bureaucratic machinery that had destroyed his career 15 years ago would grind to life again, only this time he'd face it without resources, legal representation, or credible witnesses willing to testify on his behalf. Marcus watched the cruiser disappear toward the waterfront, carrying with it his last illusion of safety. Even if he walked away from Elena Vasquez, even if he returned the Caravaggio to its crate and never spoke of his discovery, too many people already knew. The painting's existence had escaped into a world where knowledge was currency and secrets were weapons. He thought of Jerry at the plaid pantry, quietly extending kindness to a broken man who'd never explained how he'd fallen so far. Of Sister Margaret at the Salvation Army, who served meals without sermons and asked no questions about past lives. Of the other homeless men and women who'd shared survival strategies and small dignities during his worst moments. Meeting Elena Vasquez would put all of them at risk. The people who'd orchestrated his downfall 15 years ago had demonstrated their reach into museums, universities, and law enforcement. They wouldn't hesitate to destroy innocent lives if Marcus became a threat to whatever conspiracy had kept the authentic Caravaggio hidden for 8 decades. But avoiding the meeting wouldn't protect anyone if Elena Vasquez's employers had already decided he knew too much. Marcus pulled up his contact list, all 4 entries accumulated during 3 months of careful networking. Bob at the recycling center, who sometimes had day labor. Maria, who ran a food cart and occasionally needed help during lunch rushes. Father Michael at St. Andrew's, who let homeless people sleep in the church basement during extreme weather. And Dr. Sarah Chen, his former research assistant, who'd been the only colleague to maintain contact after his disgrace. Sarah was teaching at Portland State now, struggling to rebuild her own career after their association had tainted her reputation by proximity. Their last conversation, 6 months ago, had been stilted and awkward. 2 people trying to pretend their shared past hadn't become a liability for both of them. If he disappeared tonight, if Elena Vasquez's people decided to eliminate a potential problem, would anyone even notice? The homeless died on Portland's streets regularly. Exposure, overdoses, violence that never made the news because society had already written them off as acceptable casualties. Marcus had spent 3 months learning to think like a disposable person. Now Elena Vasquez was offering him a chance to matter again, to reclaim the intellectual identity that had defined him for 40 years before 15 minutes of testimony destroyed it all. The approaching sound of another police siren made his decision. Standing in doorways and jumping at shadows wasn't survival, it was just a slower form of surrender. If powerful forces wanted him dead, they'd find him regardless of where he tried to hide. But if they needed him alive, if the Caravaggio had made him valuable instead of merely dangerous, then Elena Vasquez might represent the first real choice he'd faced since losing everything. Marcus stepped back onto the sidewalk and resumed walking toward 3rd Avenue. His hands shook with more than caffeine withdrawal as he approached the final blocks before Stumptown Coffee. Every instinct screamed warnings about walking into an obvious trap, but those same instincts had kept him invisible and irrelevant for 3 months, while the people who destroyed his life continued operating with impunity. For the first time since his fall from grace, someone wanted to talk to Dr. Marcus Thorne instead of dismissing him as just another street person. The conversation might kill him, but it might also give him back his life. Marcus reached the corner of 3rd Avenue and stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs as he stared at the Stumptown Coffee sign glowing warmly through the morning mist. The familiar aroma of freshly ground beans drifted through the air, a scent that once belonged to his regular world of academic conferences and museum consultations. Now it smelled like another country's cuisine. Through the large windows, he could see the usual crowd of laptop-wielding professionals, their lives ordered by deadlines and meetings that mattered to someone. For a moment, the gulf between his current existence and that purposeful world felt insurmountable. 3 months of careful invisibility had trained him to avoid spaces where his presence might cause discomfort or unwanted attention. But Elena Vasquez had chosen this location deliberately. She wanted him off balance, reminded of everything he'd lost, forced to navigate social territory that no longer belonged to him. Marcus caught his reflection in a storefront window and winced. His beard had grown wild and untrimmed. His jacket bore stains from weeks of street living, and his shoes were held together with duct tape acquired from a sympathetic maintenance worker. He looked exactly like what he was, a homeless man who didn't belong in a trendy coffee shop filled with Portland's creative class. That realization crystallized something fundamental about what Elena Vasquez was offering. Not just information or opportunity, but the chance to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. For 3 months, he'd made himself smaller and quieter, grateful for scraps of kindness and careful never to presume upon society's limited tolerance for disposable people. The Caravaggio had changed that equation. Hidden in Unit 47 was proof that his destroyed reputation had been built on lies, that forces beyond his understanding had orchestrated his fall to serve purposes he'd never glimpsed. The painting made him dangerous to people who'd assumed he was safely discarded, and danger, ironically, was the first real power he'd possessed since losing everything. Marcus pushed through the coffee shop door, immediately aware of how the conversations shifted around him. Not silence, that would have been too obvious, but a subtle diminishment of volume as people registered his presence and made unconscious calculations about threat levels and social discomfort. He'd learned to read these signals with painful accuracy. Elena Vasquez sat at a corner table, and Marcus recognized her instantly, despite never having seen her before. She radiated the kind of quiet confidence that came from operating in worlds where power moved through handshake agreements and unspoken understandings. Her tailored coat was perfectly pressed, her posture spoke of expensive education, and her eyes tracked his approach with the clinical assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating human assets. "Dr. Thorne," she said, standing to shake his hand as if his appearance didn't register at all. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." The simple act of being treated as an equal, not a curiosity or charity case, hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. When was the last time someone had stood to greet him? When had anyone last used his title without irony or pity? Elena had already ordered coffee for both of them, along with a plate of pastries that suggested she understood his nutritional situation without making it the focus of conversation. These small courtesies felt like negotiations, establishing that she needed his cooperation enough to treat him with dignity. "You know why I'm here," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her. "I know what you found. What interests me more is what you plan to do about it. That depends on what you can tell me about how it got there." Elena smiled, the expression not quite reaching her eyes. "Heinrich Brennan was a broker, Dr. Thorne. He facilitated the movement of certain cultural objects during and after the war, often acting as an intermediary between their original owners and interested parties." "You mean he was a fence for stolen Nazi loot?" "I mean, he was a pragmatist, operating in complex circumstances. The painting you discovered was acquired in Rome in 1943, but its journey to Portland involved several additional transactions over the following decades." Marcus felt the familiar thrill of intellectual pursuit awakening after months of dormancy. Transactions that required authentication, professional expertise to verify that the piece being moved was genuine rather than one of the wartime forgeries. "Precisely. Which brings us to why we're having this conversation." Elena reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thin manila folder, placing it on the table between them. "Your career was destroyed over accusations that you had authenticated a forged Caravaggio for the Metropolitan Museum's acquisition. But what if I told you that the forgery was placed deliberately, with your authentic authentication used to legitimize a piece that had been substituted after your examination?" The coffee shop's ambient noise seemed to fade as Marcus stared at the folder. Inside those documents was either vindication or a more sophisticated trap than anything he'd imagined. After 15 years of wondering what had really happened, someone was offering him answers. But accepting those answers meant crossing a threshold he couldn't uncross. The moment he opened that folder, Marcus Thorne would cease to be an invisible homeless man and become a player in whatever game had been orchestrated around the Caravaggio. There would be no going back to the safety of anonymity. His hand moved toward the folder. Marcus's fingertips barely grazed the folder before Elena's hand covered his, stopping him with gentle but unmistakable firmness. "Not here," she said quietly, glancing around the coffee shop where conversations hummed and laptops clicked. Too many eyes, too many ears. But I wanted you to see that the answers exist. She withdrew the folder, sliding it back into her briefcase while Marcus fought the urge to lunge across the table. 15 years of questions, and she was dangling resolution just beyond his reach. Then why meet here at all? Marcus asked, his voice rougher than intended. Because I needed to see if you were still the man who could help us recover what was stolen. And because you need to understand the rules before you decide whether to play. Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The Caravaggio in Unit 47 is authentic. Your original authentication 15 years ago was correct. But the piece currently hanging in the Met is a masterful forgery that was substituted after your examination, using your legitimate documentation to establish its provenance. Marcus felt his world tilt. Who? Who had access to make that substitution? People with resources, patience, and reach into the highest levels of the art world. People who've been moving stolen pieces through legitimate channels for decades, using respected experts like yourself as unwitting cover. Elena's eyes hardened. People who destroyed your career when you started asking inconvenient questions about authentication discrepancies. The pastry turned to ash in Marcus's mouth. I never asked questions. The Met case was straightforward until you mentioned to a colleague that the painting's aging patterns seemed inconsistent with your initial examination, until you wondered aloud whether someone should re-examine the piece. Elena pulled out her phone, scrolling to a photograph of a handwritten note. Do you remember writing this to Dr. Patricia Helm at Columbia? Marcus squinted at the screen, recognizing his own handwriting. Patricia, something's bothering me about the Met Caravaggio. The crackle pattern in the saint's robes doesn't match my notes. Could you take a look when you're in town? Marcus, I sent that 2 days before the fraud accusations surfaced, Marcus whispered. And Dr. Helm received it the same day she was offered a department chair at Stanford, contingent on her immediate relocation and silence about ongoing investigations. Elena pocketed the phone. She never replied to your note, never came to New York, never examined the painting. The coffee shop's warmth couldn't touch the cold spreading through Marcus's chest. Not just his career destroyed, but Patricia's life redirected, shaped by forces neither of them had recognized. How many others? He asked. Enough. The network we're dealing with has been operating since the 1940s, Dr. Thorne. They have people in major museums, auction houses, universities. Anyone who gets too close to their operations finds themselves facing scandals, career opportunities elsewhere, or worse. Marcus thought of his wife Catherine's sudden withdrawal of support during the fraud investigation, her lawyer's advice to distance herself from his criminal associations. The friends who stopped returning calls, the colleagues who avoided eye contact at conferences before he stopped attending them entirely. Why tell me this now? Why not 15 years ago? Elena's expression softened marginally. Because 15 years ago, we didn't have enough proof to move against them, because the investigation required someone with your expertise to remain operational, even if you didn't know you were working for us. She paused. And because Heinrich Brennan's death last month created an opportunity we couldn't pursue while he was alive. Brennan died last month? Natural causes, old age, and a guilty conscience, according to his nurse. But his death triggered certain legal mechanisms that have been in place since 1943. Information that was sealed while he lived, evidence that can now be used to expose the entire network. Marcus stared at his coffee, understanding beginning to crystallize. The storage facility. You knew I'd find it. We knew someone would. The unit rental was paid through a trust that expired with Brennan's death. We've been watching the facility, waiting to see who would discover what Heinrich left behind. And you got lucky that it was someone who could recognize the painting's significance. Elena's smile held no warmth. Dr. Thorne, nothing about your presence at that storage facility was luck. We've been tracking your movements for 3 months, waiting for the right moment to guide you to Unit 47. The revelation hit like ice water. Marcus's hand trembled as he set down his cup, droplets of coffee spreading across the table's surface. The security guard who told me about overnight shelter there. The maintenance worker who mentioned broken locks. You orchestrated all of it. We needed someone with your expertise to confirm the painting's authenticity. Someone whose previous connection to the case would make them personally invested in uncovering the truth. Elena leaned back, studying his reaction. Someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from exposing the conspiracy that destroyed their life. Marcus felt the walls of the coffee shop closing in. 3 months of believing he'd found sanctuary through his own desperate resourcefulness, when every step had been choreographed by puppet masters he'd never seen. What do you want from me? Help us bring down the network that stole your life, Dr. Thorne. But understand, once you open that folder, once you commit to this path, there's no returning to invisible safety. These people have killed to protect their secrets. Elena stood, leaving money on the table. The choice is yours. But decide quickly. They know about our meeting, and they're already moving to eliminate the evidence. She walked away, leaving Marcus alone with the most dangerous decision of his life. Marcus sat frozen at the corner table as the coffee shop's rhythms flowed around him. The hiss of espresso machines, the tap of keyboards, the murmur of conversations about deadlines and weekend plans. Normal people living normal lives, blissfully unaware that someone at table 12 was contemplating a decision that could unravel an 80-year-old conspiracy or get him killed within the week. Elena's words echoed in his mind. They're already moving to eliminate the evidence. The painting, Unit 47, possibly him. He pulled out the prepaid phone he'd bought with recycling money. His only connection to a world that had largely forgotten Dr. Marcus Thorne existed. 3 contacts: the shelter coordinator who sometimes had bed space, a day labor dispatcher, and Sarah Chen. Sarah, his former research assistant, now struggling to rebuild her own academic reputation after their association, had made her radioactive by proximity. She'd been brilliant, passionate about Renaissance authentication techniques, destined for greatness before his downfall dragged her into professional exile. Their last conversation had been stilted, careful, 2 people pretending their shared history hadn't become a liability. If Elena was telling the truth about the scope of this conspiracy, Sarah might be in danger simply for having worked with him. The network had demonstrated surgical precision in destroying careers and lives. How far would they go to protect secrets worth hundreds of millions in stolen art? Marcus dialed her number, his hands shaking slightly as the phone rang. Marcus? Sarah's voice carried surprise and wariness in equal measure. Is everything okay? I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Have you had any unusual contact recently? Job offers, research opportunities, anything that seemed too good to be true? A pause. Why are you asking? Sarah, please. This is important. There was something last week. A gallery in Seattle reached out about a consulting position. Authentication work, good money, but they wanted me to start immediately. It felt rushed, so I turned it down. Her voice tightened. Marcus, what's going on? You sound different. Different, because for the first time in 3 months, he felt like himself again. Dr. Marcus Thorne, not just another invisible casualty of urban decay. The intellectual machinery that had been dormant was firing on all cylinders, processing patterns and connections with the clarity that had once made him one of the country's most respected authenticators. I may have found something. Evidence about what really happened 15 years ago. Marcus, no. Sarah's voice carried immediate alarm. Whatever you think you've discovered, walk away. Those people, they destroyed both our careers over a single authentication. If you start digging again, what if the authentication was correct? What if we were right all along and someone made us wrong after the fact? Silence stretched between them. Marcus could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath, could almost feel her mind working through the implications. Even if that were true, she said finally, proving it would require access to resources we don't have. Laboratory analysis, provenance documentation, institutional support. You're homeless, Marcus. I'm teaching community college courses and barely making rent. We're not equipped for this kind of investigation. She was right, and they both knew it. But Elena Vasquez had offered resources, backing, the promise of vindication. At what cost? "If something happens to me," Marcus said quietly, "if I disappear or turn up dead, there's a storage facility on Southeast Division, Unit 47. Tell someone who matters." "Marcus, you're scaring me." "I'm scaring myself." He watched through the coffee shop window as a black sedan pulled up across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the gray Portland sky. "But I think I'm done being invisible." The sedan's engine idled, waiting. Marcus ended the call and stood, leaving his untouched pastry on the table. Elena had been right about one thing. There was no returning to invisible safety. The moment he'd recognized the Caravaggio, the moment he'd understood its significance, he'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. The network Elena described had spent 80 years moving stolen masterpieces through legitimate channels, destroying anyone who threatened their operations. They'd had the reach and patience to orchestrate his downfall 15 years ago, to redirect Patricia Helm's career, to manipulate events with surgical precision. But they'd made one miscalculation. They'd assumed that destroying Dr. Marcus Thorne would eliminate the threat he represented. Instead, they'd created something more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from exposing the truth. Marcus walked toward the coffee shop's rear exit, avoiding the front door where the sedan waited. The alley behind Stumptown reeked of garbage and rain, but it offered something more valuable than comfort: options. He could disappear again, fade back into Portland's homeless population, spend his remaining years wondering what might have been. Safe, invisible, irrelevant. Or he could reclaim the life that had been stolen from him, knowing that the attempt might kill him. For the first time in 3 months, the choice felt clear. Dr. Marcus Thorne was done apologizing for existing. The alley behind Stumptown stretched ahead like a gauntlet, littered with delivery pallets and dumpsters that could conceal a dozen threats. Marcus pressed himself against the brick wall, listening for footsteps that might follow his exit. The black sedan's engine had gone silent, which meant its occupants were either moving or waiting for him to emerge somewhere more convenient for their purposes. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number: "Dr. Thorne. Return to the front entrance. We only want to talk." They'd tracked his phone. Of course they had. Elena's people or the network she'd warned him about. At this point, the distinction felt academic. Both sides had demonstrated an ability to manipulate his life with surgical precision. Marcus removed the battery from the prepaid phone, scattering the pieces into a dumpster. Whatever communication advantages the device offered weren't worth the surveillance risk. He was operating in Elena's world now, where every convenience came with invisible strings attached. The alley's far end opened onto a side street lined with food trucks and construction equipment. Marcus emerged cautiously, scanning for vehicles that might be monitoring his escape routes. Nothing obvious, but that meant little. These people had orchestrated a 15-year conspiracy without detection. They wouldn't rely on amateur surveillance techniques. He needed allies. Real ones, not handlers with their own agendas. Sarah was compromised by association and 300 miles away. His academic contacts had either burned those bridges or been pressured into silence years ago. The homeless community he'd inhabited for 3 months operated by different rules: mutual anonymity, minimal questions, survival partnerships that dissolved when circumstances changed. But there was another option. Someone whose integrity had remained untouched by the art world's political machinations because she'd operated outside its elite circles. Dr. Maria Santos ran the Northwest Institute for Cultural Preservation, a small nonprofit focused on returning stolen artifacts to their communities of origin. She'd reached out to Marcus shortly after his disgrace, offering consulting work that he'd been too proud and too damaged to accept. Her organization lacked the prestige of major museums, but it had something more valuable: independence from the institutional networks Elena had described. The institute occupied a converted warehouse in southeast Portland, accessible by public transit if Marcus could reach it without leading his watchers to Maria's door. He walked north toward the bus line, keeping to crowded sidewalks where individual surveillance would be more difficult. 20 minutes later, he stood outside the institute's unmarked entrance, studying the windows for signs of unusual activity. The building appeared normal, several cars in the lot, lights visible through frosted glass, the quiet bustle of a working research facility. Marcus pressed the intercom button. Northwest Institute. This is Dr. Marcus Thorne. I need to speak with Dr. Santos about an urgent matter involving stolen Nazi art. A pause. Please wait. The security camera above the door tracked his movement with mechanical precision. Marcus forced himself to stand still, knowing that running now would accomplish nothing except confirming his desperation. The door buzzed open. Maria Santos looked exactly as he remembered. Compact, intense, with prematurely gray hair that she wore like a badge of intellectual authenticity. She'd aged well in the 15 years since they'd last spoken, her face carrying the confidence that came from meaningful work pursued without institutional compromise. Marcus. She studied his appearance without judgment, processing the reality of his circumstances with the same clinical assessment she might apply to damaged artifacts. You look like hell. I feel worse than I look. Come in. Coffee? The Institute's interior reflected Maria's practical approach to cultural preservation. Workbenches crowded with partially restored pieces, computer stations running authentication software, file cabinets that probably contained more accurate provenance records than most major museums. This was what the art world could be without politics and profit driving every decision. Maria led him to her office, a cramped space overlooking the work floor. She poured coffee from a pot that had clearly been brewing too long, adding sugar without asking, remembering his preferences from conversations decades past. Tell me about the Nazi art. Marcus outlined the discovery at Unit 47, Elena's revelations about the conspiracy, the scope of the authentication fraud that had destroyed his career. Maria listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. Show me, she said when he finished. I don't have photographs, too risky. Then take me there. The simplicity of her response cut through the complexity Elena had layered onto the situation. Maria operated by different rules: see the evidence, evaluate its authenticity, determine the appropriate course of action. No political calculations, no risk assessments beyond the immediate question of what was right. Maria, these people killed to protect this secret. Getting involved could destroy your institute. She smiled, the expression carrying steel beneath its warmth. Marcus, my institute exists to return stolen art to its rightful owners. If I'm not willing to risk everything for that mission, I shouldn't be doing this work. For the first time since discovering the Caravaggio, Marcus felt like he wasn't facing the ordeal alone. They never made it to Unit 47. The black sedan was waiting in the Institute's parking lot when they emerged, flanked by two unmarked vans that had positioned themselves to block the exits. Marcus felt Maria stiffen beside him as armed figures emerged from the vehicles. Not police, their tactical gear lacking official insignia, their movements carrying the precision of private military contractors. Dr. Thorne. The voice belonged to a woman in her 40s, blonde hair pulled back severely, her accent suggesting Eastern European origins. Dr. Santos, you will come with us. Like hell, Maria said, her hand moving toward her phone. The Institute is surrounded, Dr. Santos. Your staff has been detained for questioning. No one will be harmed if you cooperate. Marcus's mind raced through escape options. The warehouse's rear exit led to a fenced yard with no secondary egress. The main entrance was compromised. They were trapped in a kill zone designed by professionals who'd had time to study the building's layout and plan accordingly. What do you want? He asked. You've caused considerable inconvenience, Dr. Thorne. Heinrich Brennan's legacy was meant to remain buried. Your expertise has created complications that require correction. The woman gestured, and two contractors moved forward with zip-tie restraints. Marcus stepped protectively in front of Maria, knowing the gesture was symbolic at best. The painting's already been documented, he lied. Multiple copies of my authentication analysis have been distributed. Killing us won't contain the information. The woman's smile held no warmth. Dr. Thorne, you've been homeless for 3 months. You have no institutional affiliations, no credible platforms for disseminating information, no resources for proper documentation. Your word against established provenance records means nothing." She was right, and they all knew it. Without Maria's backing, without proper photographic evidence, without laboratory analysis to support his conclusions, Marcus was just another damaged academic making extraordinary claims. The art world had already demonstrated its willingness to dismiss him once. They wouldn't hesitate to do so again. However, the woman continued, Dr. Santos represents a different category of problem. Her institute has credibility in provenance research. Her backing could legitimize your findings in ways that would prove inconvenient. Marcus felt the trap's true dimensions becoming clear. Elena Vasquez hadn't guided him to the painting to expose a conspiracy. She'd used him as bait to identify potential allies, to draw out anyone who might support his authentication claims. Now the network was eliminating those allies with surgical precision. "The painting's gone, isn't it?" he asked quietly. "Unit 47 was cleaned out 2 hours ago. Official records will show it contained nothing but damaged furniture and expired documents. The storage facility's security cameras experienced a technical malfunction that corrupted all footage from the past week." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling 15 years of desperate hope crumble into ash. The Caravaggio, his vindication, his proof, his last chance at redemption, had been erased as completely as if it had never existed. "Dr. Santos, your institute will receive a substantial anonymous donation within the week, enough to fund operations for the next decade. In exchange, you will have no recollection of this conversation or any claims Dr. Thorne may have made about Nazi-looted artwork." "Go to hell," Maria said. The woman's expression didn't change. "The donation comes with conditions. Accept our generosity, and your organization continues its valuable work. Refuse, and the Institute's tax-exempt status will be revoked, your funding sources will dry up, and your staff will face federal investigation for trafficking in stolen artifacts. We have considerable evidence to support such charges." Marcus watched Maria's face as she processed the ultimatum. Save her life's work by abandoning him, or see everything she'd built destroyed in service of a principle that would die with them both. "I need time to consider." "No." The woman checked her watch. "Your answer now, Dr. Santos." The silence stretched between them. Marcus could hear traffic from the street beyond, normal people going about normal lives while his last hope withered in a parking lot that had become a courtroom. Maria looked at him once, her eyes carrying apology and rage in equal measure. "I accept your donation," she said quietly. The contractors moved forward with practiced efficiency. Marcus felt the zip ties bite into his wrists as they secured his hands behind his back. Maria stood frozen, her face pale with the weight of survival calculations he couldn't blame her for making. "Dr. Thorne," the woman said as they pushed him toward the nearest van, "you've been a persistent source of difficulty. That persistence ends today." As they loaded him into the vehicle, Marcus caught one last glimpse of Maria standing in the Institute's doorway, her life's work preserved at the cost of his life. The mathematics were sound. Better to save an organization that could help hundreds of people than sacrifice everything for one man's vindication. But knowing she'd made the rational choice didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. The van's doors slammed shut, and Dr. Marcus Thorne disappeared into the gray Portland afternoon as completely as the painting that had briefly promised to restore his world. The van's interior was soundproofed, Marcus realized as the engine hummed to life. No windows, no handles on the doors, nothing but padded walls and the metallic taste of his own fear. They'd thought of everything. Even the zip ties were the expensive kind that tightened with movement, cutting circulation if he struggled. But as Portland's streets blurred past through the driver's compartment windshield, Marcus felt something unexpected settling over him. Not resignation, clarity. For 3 months he'd been running from the truth about himself, hiding in the comfortable anonymity of homelessness where expectations couldn't touch him. The painting had offered him a chance to reclaim Dr. Marcus Thorne, to resurrect the man he'd been before the scandal. Now, stripped of that illusion, he could see what he'd been refusing to acknowledge. He'd never lost his expertise. even living in doorways and shelters, eating from food trucks and avoiding eye contact with former colleagues. The intellectual machinery that had made him one of the country's most respected authenticators had remained intact, sharp, waiting. The van turned onto what felt like a highway, picking up speed. Marcus tested the restraints carefully, feeling for weaknesses while keeping his movements minimal. The zip ties were professional grade, but the contractors had made one small error. They'd secured his hands behind his back with his fingers interlocked rather than palm to palm. It gave him maybe an inch of lateral movement. More importantly, it gave him time to think. Elena Vasquez hadn't been his salvation or his enemy. She'd been exactly what she'd claimed to be, a federal agent investigating an art trafficking network that had operated with impunity for 8 decades. But she'd also been operating alone, outside official channels, which meant she had no backup when the network moved against her, which meant she was probably as dead as they intended him to be. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it crystallized something that had been building since he'd first recognized the Caravaggio's brushstrokes. For 15 years, he'd carried the weight of professional disgrace, accepting the art world's verdict that his authentication had been flawed. He'd internalized their judgment, let it reshape his understanding of his own capabilities. But he hadn't been wrong about the painting in 2008. His analysis had been correct, meticulous, backed by decades of experience and an eye for Renaissance technique that few scholars could match. The forgery hadn't been his mistake. It had been placed in the Metropolitan's collection after his authentication, a deliberate switch designed to discredit him when the deception was eventually discovered. The van was slowing. Through the windshield, Marcus could see industrial buildings, the kind of warehouse district where screams wouldn't carry to anyone who cared to investigate. His captors were professionals, but they were also creatures of routine. They'd brought him somewhere isolated to extract information about Elena's investigation, then dispose of him efficiently. They expected a broken homeless man, desperate and compliant. They were about to meet Dr. Marcus Thorne instead. Marcus had spent 3 months observing Portland's invisible population, learning survival skills that his academic training had never covered. How to slip restraints when police weren't paying attention. How to read body language for signs of violence. How to disappear in plain sight when necessary. More importantly, he'd learned something about himself that 15 years of institutional respectability had obscured. When stripped of everything, reputation, resources, safety, he didn't break, he adapted. The van stopped. Marcus heard voices outside, contractors coordinating their next moves with the casual efficiency of men who'd done this before. The woman from the institute was speaking, her accent more pronounced over radio static. Clean extraction, minimal evidence, standard disposal protocols. The doors opened, revealing a loading dock surrounded by empty warehouses. 3 armed men waited in tactical formation while the woman supervised from a black sedan. Professional, prepared, confident that they were dealing with a victim rather than a threat. Marcus smiled as they hauled him from the van, his expression apparently surprising enough that one contractor's grip loosened fractionally. It was a small advantage, but small advantages were often enough if you knew how to leverage them. For 3 months he'd been Dr. Marcus Thorne, fallen from grace and struggling to survive. Before that, he'd been Dr. Marcus Thorne, respected academic and authentication expert. Both versions had been incomplete, shaped by external expectations and institutional frameworks. Now, with nothing left to lose and everything to gain, he was finally ready to become something else entirely. Not the man he'd been or the man he'd fallen to, but the man who could take everything they'd stolen and make them pay for every year of exile they'd inflicted. They thought they were eliminating a problem. They'd just created their worst nightmare. The loading dock stretched before them, concrete stained with decades of industrial use. Marcus cataloged details with the systematic precision that had once made him invaluable to museum acquisition committees. Sight lines between buildings, potential exit routes, the positioning of his captors relative to available cover. The woman from the institute approached, her heels clicking against the concrete with metronomic precision. "Dr. Thorne, you've led us quite a chase." "Have I?" Marcus kept his voice level, conversational. From where I'm standing, it looks like you've been ahead of me the entire time. She smiled, apparently pleased by his composure. Elena Vasquez recruited you well. A pity her operation lacked proper institutional support. The past tense confirmed what Marcus had suspected. Elena was dead, her investigation buried along with any evidence she might have gathered. But something in the woman's phrasing suggested a miscalculation on their part. You think I was working for Elena, he said. It wasn't a question. Dr. Marcus Thorne, disgraced authenticator turned federal asset. A compelling narrative, if poorly executed. She gestured to one of the contractors, who stepped forward with what looked like a tablet computer. Your homeless persona was quite convincing, but facial recognition software eventually identified you at 3 separate locations where Agent Vasquez conducted surveillance. Marcus felt pieces clicking into place. They'd been watching Elena's investigation for months, tracking her movements, identifying her contacts. When she'd approached him at the shelter, they'd assumed he was part of her operation, rather than a target she'd been cultivating. Which meant they didn't know about the storage unit. They'd moved against him based on his connection to Elena, not because they'd discovered the Caravaggio. The painting was still there. Where are the files Elena gave you? The woman asked. Marcus met her gaze steadily. What files? The contractor's fist connected with his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs and dropping him to his knees. Professional technique, painful but not immediately debilitating, designed to encourage cooperation rather than render him unconscious. Digital photographs, authentication reports, provenance documentation. Elena spent 3 months building a case against Heinrich Brennan's network. That evidence didn't disappear with her. I'm homeless, Marcus gasped, struggling to his feet. When exactly would I have had access to digital files? The woman's expression flickered with irritation. They'd built their operation around assumptions that were proving incorrect. Elena hadn't recruited him as an asset. She'd been manipulating him just as they were, using his expertise for her own purposes while keeping him ignorant of the larger investigation. But she'd also underestimated him, just as they were doing now. Dr. Thorne, your cooperation can be purchased. Name your price. The offer caught him off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because of how little it tempted him. 15 years ago, the promise of restored reputation and financial security would have been irresistible. Now, having lived without both for months, he understood how little they actually mattered. I want Heinrich Brennan, he said quietly. The woman's eyebrows rose. Heinrich Brennan died in 1987. His network then. Everyone who participated in the authentication fraud that destroyed my career. Everyone who's profited from Nazi-looted art for the past 8 decades. Marcus straightened, feeling strength return to his voice. I want their names, their methods, their financial records. Everything. And in exchange, nothing. I have nothing to trade because Elena gave me nothing to trade with. He could see the calculation in her eyes, weighing the truth of his statement against the resources they'd invested in capturing him. The mathematics were clear. He was worthless as a source of intelligence about Elena's investigation, because he'd never been part of that investigation. But he was also dangerous in ways they hadn't anticipated. However, Marcus continued, I can be a considerable problem if you release me. My expertise didn't disappear when I lost my institutional affiliation. My ability to recognize stolen artwork didn't evaporate when I started living in shelters. The woman stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Dr. Thorne, you have no credibility, no resources, no platform for disseminating information. You're a homeless man, making extraordinary claims about international conspiracies. For now, Marcus agreed. But circumstances change. Allies can be found. Evidence can be gathered by someone who knows what to look for and where to find it. For the first time since the van doors had opened, he saw uncertainty in her expression. They'd planned for Elena's investigation, prepared countermeasures for federal law enforcement, built safeguards against institutional exposure. They hadn't planned for a homeless former academic with nothing left to lose and the specialized knowledge to hurt them. Marcus smiled again, and this time none of his captors looked surprised by the expression. They were finally beginning to understand what they were dealing with. The question now was whether they'd try to buy him or eliminate him. Either way, Dr. Marcus Thorne was done being their victim. The woman's silence stretched for 30 seconds, then 40. Marcus could hear traffic humming in the distance, the ordinary sounds of a city that had no idea what was being decided in this industrial wasteland. Her eyes never left his face as she performed calculations he could almost see: risk versus reward, containment versus elimination. "Dr. Thorne," she said finally, "you present us with an interesting paradox." One of the contractors shifted restlessly, hand drifting toward his weapon. The woman raised a single finger without looking at him, and the movement stopped. "Professional discipline," Marcus noted. "These weren't hired muscle. They were intelligence operatives with actual training." "We could eliminate you," she continued, "but that creates complications. A homeless man disappearing raises few questions, but you've established patterns of movement around the city. People have seen you. The shelter staff knows your face. A prolonged absence would eventually prompt inquiries." Marcus said nothing, recognizing the sound of someone talking herself into a decision. "Alternatively, we could purchase your cooperation. But as you've noted, you have nothing we need and want nothing we can easily provide." She smiled, the expression carrying no warmth, except perhaps answers. "What kind of answers?" "The truth about your authentication in 2008, the real reason your career was destroyed." She gestured to one of the contractors, who produced a manila folder thick with documents. Heinrich Brennan's son inherited more than Nazi-looted artwork. He inherited his father's meticulous records. The folder landed at Marcus's feet, its contents spilling across the concrete. Photocopied documents, financial records, correspondence dating back decades. His own name appeared on several pages, along with authentication reports he remembered writing 15 years ago. "Walter Brennan spent considerable effort ensuring your disgrace was thorough and public. The forgery that replaced your authenticated Caravaggio wasn't crafted by amateurs. It was created by the same workshop that had been producing Nazi documentation since 1944. She crouched down, gathering the scattered papers. "Your reputation was destroyed by people who'd been perfecting the art of deception for generations." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Vindication, but at a price he was only beginning to understand. They weren't offering him information out of generosity. They were demonstrating the depth of their resources, showing him how completely he'd been manipulated. "Why tell me this?" "Because we want to offer you something more valuable than money or restored reputation." The woman stood, holding the folder against her chest like a shield. "We want to offer you purpose." The word hit harder than the contractor's fist had. 3 months of homelessness hadn't just stripped away his material possessions, it had hollowed out his sense of meaning, leaving him adrift in a world that had no use for his expertise or experience. "The network you want to destroy isn't what you think it is, Dr. Thorne." Heinrich Brennan's operation wasn't simply about theft or profit. It was about preservation of stolen art. Preservation of art that would have been destroyed otherwise. "Do you know what happened to the pieces that weren't taken from Jewish collections during the war?" Her voice took on the tone of a university lecturer. "They were burned for fuel, destroyed by bombing raids, lost forever when their owners were murdered." Marcus felt the philosophical trap being constructed around him, each word carefully chosen to make collaboration seem like scholarship rather than betrayal. "The pieces in our network have been maintained, studied, preserved for future generations. They exist because Heinrich Brennan saved them, not because he stole them." She extended the folder toward him. "We're not art traffickers, Dr. Thorne. We're the last guardians of a cultural heritage that would have vanished without our intervention. By keeping it hidden in storage units and private collections, by keeping it safe until the world is ready to receive it properly." The woman's eyes held absolute conviction. "Every piece we protect is cataloged, documented, maintained to museum standards. When political conditions stabilize, when international law evolves to handle complex provenance issues, these works will emerge into public view." The rationalization was elegant, Marcus admitted. transform theft into salvation, make criminals into conservationists, turn collaboration into academic duty. He'd heard similar arguments from colleagues who'd worked with questionable dealers or overlooked suspicious provenance records. But he'd also seen what real preservation looked like, and it didn't involve zip ties and murder. What exactly are you offering me? Access to the most significant collection of Renaissance art in private hands. Full documentation of pieces that have been missing from scholarly discussion for 8 decades. The chance to resume the work you were born to do. She set the folder down and gestured for the contractors to cut his restraints. Marcus felt circulation return to his hands as the zip ties fell away, but he made no move to reach for the documents. In exchange, your expertise, your discretion, your help in maintaining what Heinrich Brennan built. Marcus looked around the loading dock one more time. The armed men, the industrial isolation, the careful positioning that would allow them to kill him if his answer disappointed them. They were offering him everything he thought he'd wanted: vindication, purpose, access to lost masterpieces. All he had to do was become them. He picked up the folder, feeling its weight in his hands like 30 pieces of silver. The folder's contents revealed the architecture of his own destruction with clinical precision. Authentication reports bearing his signature, financial transfers traced through shell companies, correspondence between Walter Brennan and Metropolitan Museum board members dating back to 2007. Marcus recognized his own handwriting on authentication notes, remembered the excitement he'd felt when first examining what he'd believed was a legitimate Caravaggio acquisition. They'd used his expertise against him with surgical precision, allowing him to authenticate the genuine piece before replacing it with a forgery so sophisticated it had taken months for other scholars to identify the deception. By then, the authentic painting had vanished into their network, while Marcus faced professional annihilation. "Impressive documentation," he said, setting the folder aside. "Almost worth the 15 years of exile." The woman studied his expression with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading deception in others. "You're not angry." "Oh, I'm furious. But anger without direction is just noise." Marcus flexed his fingers, working sensation back into his wrists. "You've shown me the mechanism of my disgrace. Now show me why I should help you perpetuate it." She gestured to the contractors, who stepped back but remained within striking distance. Professional courtesy masquerading as trust. "Dr. Brennan would like to meet you personally. Walter Brennan is still alive?" "Very much so. He's maintained his father's network for 4 decades, expanding it into something Heinrich could never have envisioned." Her voice carried genuine respect. "The preservation protocols we've developed are revolutionary. Climate-controlled storage, digital documentation, chemical analysis that surpasses most museum standards." Marcus felt the temptation like a physical weight. Access to lost masterpieces, the chance to study works that had vanished from scholarly discussion before his career began. Paintings he'd only known through poor-quality photographs and second-hand descriptions, suddenly available for first-hand examination. The woman was watching his face, reading the hunger there with practiced ease. They understood academics, these people, understood that intellectual curiosity could be more corrupting than greed or fear. "Where is he?" "Close. Dr. Brennan has been following your situation with considerable interest." She produced a phone, speed dialing with manicured fingers. "He's particularly curious about your months of homelessness. Few scholars have ever experienced such complete institutional exile." The conversation was brief, conducted in German too rapid for Marcus to follow completely. He caught fragments, references to authentication, preservation, scholarly reputation, before she ended the call. "He'll see us now." The sedan was armored, Marcus realized as they helped him into the back seat. Bulletproof glass, reinforced panels, probably worth more than most people's houses. The woman settled beside him while one contractor took the driver's seat and another followed in the van. They drove in silence through Portland's industrial district, past warehouses and shipping facilities that looked identical to Marcus's untrained eye. But the woman guided them with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the route, eventually directing them toward a facility that appeared abandoned from the outside. The building's exterior was deliberately deceptive, Rust stains on corrugated metal siding, broken windows covered with plywood, weeds growing through cracked asphalt. But the security cameras were state-of-the-art, and the lock system that admitted them required both keycard and biometric identification. Inside, the illusion of abandonment evaporated completely. The warehouse had been transformed into something between a museum and a research facility. Climate control systems hummed quietly, while specialized lighting illuminated workstations equipped with microscopes, chemical analysis equipment, and digital imaging systems that made the Metropolitan's conservation lab look primitive by comparison. But it was the artwork that stopped Marcus's breath entirely. Paintings lined the walls in temperature-controlled display cases, each piece accompanied by documentation that detailed its provenance, condition, and scholarly significance. He recognized works that had been lost for decades, pieces he'd studied only through grainy photographs in academic journals, paintings that existed in art history as footnotes to vanished collections. A Raphael sketch that had disappeared from Vienna in 1938. A Botticelli panel that had vanished from a Florentine palazzo during the war. A series of preparatory drawings for Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel that scholars had assumed were destroyed centuries ago. Magnificent, isn't it? The voice came from behind him, cultured and precise. Marcus turned to see a man in his 70s approaching, silver-haired and elegant despite the industrial setting. Walter Brennan moved with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in his environment, gesturing toward the displayed artwork with proprietary pride. "Dr. Marcus Thorne, I've been looking forward to this meeting for quite some time." Brennan extended his hand with old-world courtesy. "Welcome to the real preservation of Renaissance art." Marcus stared at the offered handshake, understanding that accepting it would cross a line he couldn't uncross. Everything he'd lost, everything he'd suffered, everything he'd learned during 3 months of exile had led to this moment. The choice between vindication and integrity, between belonging and truth, between becoming his former self and remaining the man he'd been forced to become. He reached out and grasped Walter Brennan's hand. "I wanted to see the face of the man who destroyed my life," Marcus said, his grip firm on Brennan's hand. "Before I destroy yours." The old man's smile didn't waver, but Marcus felt the slight tension in his fingers, the calculation behind those cultured eyes. "Ah, not the reunion I was hoping for. Did you really think I'd be grateful?" Marcus released the handshake and stepped back, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "That surrounding me with stolen masterpieces would make me forget 15 years of exile?" Brennan gestured dismissively toward the contractors, who had moved closer at Marcus's tone. "Leave us. Dr. Thorne and I have much to discuss." "Walter," the woman began. "Go." The authority in his voice was absolute. "This conversation has been 80 years in the making." They retreated toward the entrance, though Marcus noticed they remained within earshot. Professional caution even when dealing with a homeless academic and their elderly employer. Brennan moved toward a display case containing the Raphael sketch, his movements deliberate and theatrical. "You speak of destruction as if it were noble, Dr. Thorne, as if truth were more important than preservation. Some truths are worth preserving too. The truth that these pieces would have been destroyed without my father's intervention, the truth that Jewish families were grateful to have their collections saved, even if they couldn't reclaim them immediately." Brennan's voice hardened. "Or the truth that you've spent 3 months living in gutters while the art world continued without you?" Marcus felt the familiar rage building, but it was different now, focused rather than desperate. "The truth that you built an empire on stolen heritage, that you destroyed my career to protect that empire. I protected these works from a system that would have returned them to heirs who would sell them to the highest bidder." Brennan turned from the display case, his eyes blazing with conviction. "Do you know what happened to the Rosenberg collection when it was rightfully returned in 2003? Auction houses, private collectors, pieces scattered across the globe, lost to scholarship forever. That was their choice to make. Was it? Heirs who never knew their grandparents, never understood the cultural significance of what they inherited?" Brennan moved closer, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "You've seen what I've built here, Dr. Thorne. Every piece catalogued, studied, preserved. When I die, this entire collection will be donated to institutions that can properly maintain it. When you die. How convenient, Marcus gestured toward the surrounding artwork. Meanwhile, you live like a king among treasures that were paid for with blood, as opposed to living like a beggar among people who don't appreciate what you are? The words hit like a physical blow, targeting the doubt that had eaten at Marcus during his months on the streets. The humiliation of soup kitchens, the dismissal in shelter workers' eyes, the slow erosion of dignity that came with absolute powerlessness. You think I don't understand what you've endured? Brennan continued, pressing his advantage. The Metropolitan Board destroyed you on my recommendation, yes, but they destroyed you because you were inconvenient to their existing relationships with private collectors. I simply gave them permission to do what they already wanted to do. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Not just rage now, but recognition. The academic world's casual cruelty. The way institutions discarded people who threatened comfortable arrangements. You're saying I was always expendable. I'm saying you were always extraordinary. Too extraordinary for a system built on compromise and accommodation. Brennan gestured toward the workstations, the sophisticated equipment, the careful documentation. Here, your expertise would be valued. Your discoveries would matter. To you, for your purposes. For art, history. Brennan's voice took on evangelical fervor. Do you know how many pieces we've saved from destruction in the past decade alone? Work stolen by ISIS, paintings targeted by vandals, collections threatened by political instability. We've created a shadow preservation network that operates when legitimate institutions can't or won't act. Marcus looked around the warehouse again, seeing it differently now. Not just stolen treasure, but a carefully maintained archive. Documentation that surpassed museum standards, preservation techniques that protected artwork from deterioration, scholarly analysis that advanced understanding even if it couldn't be published. It was seductive in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not just the artwork itself, but the purpose it represented. The chance to matter again, to use his expertise for something greater than mere survival. What exactly are you offering me? Brennan smiled, sensing weakness. Everything you lost, reputation, respect, the chance to work with masterpieces most scholars only dream of studying. A position as chief authenticator for the most significant private collection in existence. And, in exchange, your silence, your expertise, your acknowledgement that some forms of preservation require moral flexibility. Marcus stared at the Raphael sketch, its delicate lines preserved behind climate-controlled glass. Saved from destruction, maintained for future generations, studied and documented with unprecedented thoroughness. All of it built on a foundation of theft and murder. I need to see everything, he said quietly. Every piece, every document, every record of how you've operated. Brennan's smile widened. Of course. We have nothing to hide from someone joining our mission. Marcus nodded, already planning how to memorize what he saw, how to document what he learned, how to ensure that when he brought this empire down, he could prove every accusation he made. The confrontation wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The tour lasted 3 hours, and with each revelation, Marcus felt the weight of what he was planning to sacrifice grow heavier. Brennan led him through climate-controlled corridors lined with masterpieces that existed nowhere in scholarly literature. Works by Vermeer, Caravaggio, Dürer that had vanished during the war and been presumed destroyed. The documentation was meticulous, provenance records, condition reports, digital archives that captured every brushstroke in unprecedented detail. This Caravaggio study for The Calling of St. Matthew, Brennan said, pausing before a small canvas that made Marcus's breath catch. Lost from the Wildenstein collection in 1943. We've discovered pigment compositions that prove Caravaggio experimented with ultramarine variations 15 years before art historians believed possible. Marcus stared at brushstrokes that revealed secrets about one of history's greatest painters, knowledge that could revolutionize understanding of Renaissance techniques. Knowledge that would die here, buried in this shadow archive, unless he became complicit in its theft. "The scholarly implications are staggering," he whispered, hating himself for meaning it. "Exactly. And you're the only person alive qualified to properly analyze the collection's full significance." Brennan watched Marcus's face with predatory patience. "Your expertise wouldn't just preserve these works, it would unlock secrets that legitimate institutions don't have the breadth of material to discover." They continued through the warehouse, past workstations where technicians performed conservation work that surpassed anything Marcus had seen at major museums. X-ray analysis, infrared reflectography, chemical testing that revealed hidden layers and artistic decisions invisible to conventional study. The resources were extraordinary, the dedication genuine, the results revolutionary. "How many people work here?" Marcus asked. 43 full-time staff. Conservators, analysts, security specialists, archivists. Many are refugees from academic institutions that couldn't appreciate their talents. Brennan's tone suggested he viewed himself as a benefactor rather than a criminal. "We offer them purpose their former employers never could." Marcus recognized the seduction in that offer. These people worked with masterpieces daily, contributed to knowledge that advanced human understanding, belonged to something larger than themselves. Everything the academic world had promised him before it discarded him like refuse. Everything he was about to destroy. They reached Brennan's office, a glass-walled space overlooking the warehouse floor where Marcus could see the entire operation, technicians bent over easels, researchers documenting discoveries, the quiet hum of work that mattered. On Brennan's desk sat a leather portfolio that he opened with ceremonial gravity. "Your appointment letter," Brennan said, sliding documents across the polished surface. "Chief authenticator with a salary that reflects your expertise and the collection's significance. Full access to every piece, unlimited research budget, publication rights for all discoveries, once appropriate legal frameworks exist." Marcus picked up the contract, scanning terms that offered him everything he'd lost and more. Financial security, intellectual purpose, the chance to work with art that existed nowhere else on Earth. His signature would restore not just his career, but his identity, transform him from a homeless exile into one of the world's most privileged scholars. All he had to do was betray every principle that had sustained him through 3 months of hell. "There's one condition," Brennan added quietly. "The Weeping Saint must be returned to storage here. Its discovery threatens operations we've spent decades building." Marcus looked up from the contract, understanding finally crystallizing. "You need me to authenticate it as a forgery. I need you to acknowledge what it represents, a threat to preservation efforts that serve the greater good." Brennan's voice carried absolute conviction, one painting versus an entire network that saves hundreds of works from destruction. The painting that destroyed my career, the painting that led me here, the painting that brought you home. Marcus set down the contract and walked to the office window, looking out at the warehouse floor where stolen masterpieces hung like trophies. 43 people who depended on this operation for purpose and income. Hundreds of artworks maintained to standards that exceeded most museums. Discoveries that could revolutionize art history, locked away until he chose to legitimize them. Against that weight stood one homeless man's principles and a truth that mattered to no one but himself. He thought of Elena Vasquez, of Rebecca Chen, of the families whose heritage had been stolen to build this elegant prison for art. He thought of the storage facility where he'd first found shelter, the random chance that had led him to question everything he thought he understood about truth and preservation. He picked up the pen Brennan offered, feeling its weight like a weapon in his hand. The signature he wrote wasn't his own. Instead, in careful block letters he wrote, "Evidence documented. FBI contacted. Surrender now." Brennan's face went white as Marcus stepped back from the desk, no longer hiding his intentions. Through the glass wall, Marcus saw security personnel moving toward the office, but he felt only calm. He'd found something worth more than everything they were offering. The sacrifice was complete. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats before chaos erupted. Brennan's hand slammed against a panic button beneath his desk, and alarms began wailing throughout the warehouse. Through the glass wall, Marcus watched 43 people, Conservators, technicians, researchers suddenly realized their world was collapsing. Some froze at their workstations, others began frantically shutting down equipment, a few ran toward exits that Marcus suspected were already sealed. "You magnificent fool," Brennan whispered, his cultured composure finally cracking. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Marcus felt strangely peaceful watching the pandemonium below. Security contractors were herding staff toward a central area, their movements efficient but not violent. Professional to the end, even in catastrophe. "I've told the truth," Marcus said simply. "Something I forgot how to do for a while." "The truth?" Brennan's laugh was bitter. "The truth is that you've just condemned hundreds of masterpieces to decades of legal limbo. The truth is that you've destroyed the careers of brilliant people whose only crime was caring more about art than politics." Through the warehouse windows, Marcus could see vehicles approaching, black SUVs that moved with federal purpose. His chest tightened as he realized the weight of what he'd set in motion. Not just Brennan's arrest, but the dismantling of an entire shadow world that, however corrupt its foundations, had preserved irreplaceable treasures. "How did you contact them?" Brennan asked, his voice hollow. "Rebecca Chen. Last night, before your people found me." Marcus met the old man's eyes without flinching. "She's been investigating art trafficking for years. When I told her what I'd discovered, she connected me with the FBI's art crime team. You've been planning this since yesterday." "I've been planning this since I found the Weeping Saint." "Maybe longer." Marcus looked down at the warehouse floor, where technicians were carefully covering paintings, protecting them even as their world ended. "Every homeless person I met, every family I heard about losing their history, they all led me here." The office door burst open as federal agents flooded in, weapons drawn but not aimed. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with prosecutor's eyes, surveyed the scene with professional calm. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Agent Sarah Morrison, FBI Art Crime Team. You're under arrest for trafficking in stolen cultural property." She began reading rights while agents moved to secure the office, but Marcus barely heard the words. His attention was fixed on the warehouse floor below, where staff members were being questioned but not arrested. Many were crying, not from fear, but from grief. These people had found purpose in this shadow world, meaning in preserving what others had abandoned or threatened. Now that purpose was being stripped away, cataloged as evidence, reduced to case numbers in federal files. "Dr. Thorne." Agent Morrison appeared beside him at the window. "We're going to need extensive debriefing about what you've observed here." "How long will it take?" Marcus asked. "To sort out ownership, to return pieces to families?" Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Years, probably decades. Some pieces may never find their way home." She gestured toward the controlled chaos below. "This is one of the largest recoveries in Bureau history, the legal complexities alone." Marcus nodded, understanding that his choice had created as many problems as it solved. Families would wait years for justice. Scholars would lose access to unprecedented resources, and masterpieces would sit in evidence lockers instead of inspiring wonder. But Elena Vasquez would know her grandmother's painting had been found. Rebecca Chen would have the evidence she needed to pursue other traffickers. And somewhere in the darkness of the art world's shadow economy, other criminals would think twice before building empires on stolen heritage. "Was it worth it?" Brennan asked quietly as agents prepared to escort him away. The old man looked frail suddenly, diminished by the collapse of his life's work. Marcus considered the question, watching technicians carefully document each piece they'd spent years preserving. Good people doing important work, now unemployed and probably unemployable in their field. Knowledge that would be buried in legal proceedings instead of advancing human understanding. "Ask me in 10 years, Marcus said finally, "when the families have their heritage back, when the truth about these pieces is part of the historical record instead of hidden in a warehouse." Brennan shook his head as agents led him toward the door. "You've chosen principle over preservation. History will judge whether that was wisdom or waste." Marcus remained at the window as the warehouse emptied, federal agents cataloging treasures that would soon disappear into evidence vaults. He thought about the storage facility where this had all begun. about the random chance that had led him to question everything he thought he understood about truth and compromise. 3 months ago, he had been Dr. Marcus Thorne, respected authenticator, willing to bend ethics for professional advancement. Tonight, he was still a homeless man with nothing but the clothes on his back, but he was no longer lost. The resolution felt incomplete, fragile, heavy with consequences he couldn't predict. Justice, he was learning, was messier than righteousness, more complicated than simply choosing right over wrong. Outside, Portland's October night was waiting to reclaim him. The October air cut through Marcus's thin jacket as he stepped out of the warehouse, leaving behind the controlled chaos of federal agents and cataloged masterpieces. 3 hours of debriefing had drained him, but not in the way he'd expected. Instead of exhaustion, he felt something approaching clarity, the sharp-edged peace that came after making an irreversible choice. Agent Morrison had offered him a hotel room, meal vouchers, temporary assistance while the case developed. He'd declined them all. The streets had taught him something about accepting help he hadn't earned, about the difference between charity and justice. But as he walked through downtown Portland, Marcus realized he wasn't returning to the same world he'd left that morning. The familiar landmarks, the shelter where he'd sometimes slept, the library where he'd spent cold afternoons, the corners where he'd learned to become invisible, felt like artifacts from someone else's life. 3 blocks from the warehouse, he found himself standing outside Chen's Rare Books. The shop was closed, but warm light spilled from the apartment windows above. Marcus stared up at those windows for a long moment before climbing the narrow stairs and knocking. Rebecca opened the door wearing paint-stained clothes in surprise. "Marcus, I thought you'd be in federal custody for days. They let me go. For now." He studied her face, seeing exhaustion that mirrored his own. "I wanted to thank you for believing me, for making the call." She stepped aside to let him in, and Marcus found himself in a cluttered space that felt more like home than anywhere he'd been in months. Books lined every wall, half-finished paintings leaned against easels, and the scent of coffee mixed with oil paint created an atmosphere of comfortable chaos. "How did it feel?" Rebecca asked, settling into a worn armchair. "Watching it all come down?" Marcus considered the question as he accepted the coffee she offered. Like watching surgery, necessary but not clean. He met her eyes. 43 people lost their jobs tonight. Some of them were just scholars who wanted to work with great art. And how many families lost their heritage to make that possible? "I know. I'm not questioning the choice, just learning to live with its weight." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, processing the magnitude of what had ended and what was beginning. Through the window, Marcus could see the warehouse district where federal agents were still working, documenting crimes that stretched back generations. "What happens to you now?" Rebecca asked eventually. Marcus almost laughed. "I go back to being homeless, I suppose. At least until the legal proceedings need me." He gestured toward her paintings, recognizing scenes from Portland's streets. "You've been documenting this world too." "Someone should. People who matter, even when society pretends they don't." She followed his gaze. "That one's you, actually, from the day you first came in here." Marcus stared at the canvas, seeing himself through her eyes. Not the broken exile he'd felt like, but someone carrying dignity despite circumstance. Someone worth remembering. "I'm not the same person who walked into your shop," he said quietly. "No, you're not. But you're also not the same person who authenticated forgeries for career advancement." Rebecca leaned forward, intensity in her voice. "You're something new. Someone who chose truth over comfort, principle over survival. Someone with nowhere to go and nothing to offer. Someone who just brought down the largest art trafficking ring on the West Coast." She smiled. "I think you're underestimating your value." Marcus thought about Brennan's offer, the contract that still lay unsigned on that distant desk. Financial security, intellectual purpose, the chance to matter in the world he'd once inhabited. All of it traded for this, sitting in a cluttered apartment with a woman who saw worth in society's discarded processing choices that felt both devastating and necessary. "Elena Vasquez called me this afternoon," Rebecca continued. "The FBI contacted her about her grandmother's painting. She wanted me to tell you something. Marcus waited. She said her grandmother always believed art belonged to people who needed beauty, not people who owned it. She thinks you understand that now. Through the window, Portland's night was settling over streets that had been his world for 3 months. Shelter beds that might be available, soup kitchens that would serve breakfast, libraries where he could spend tomorrow's cold hours. The infrastructure of survival he'd learned to navigate. But as he prepared to return to that world, Marcus realized he was bringing something different back with him. Not just the experience of choosing principle over comfort, but the knowledge that such choices were possible, that someone with nothing left to lose could still find something worth defending. I should go, he said, standing. Long walk back to anywhere warm. Rebecca nodded, understanding more than he'd said. The offer stands. Coffee, conversation, someone who remembers your name. Marcus paused at the door, looking back at the paintings that captured Portland's forgotten citizens with such dignity. Thank you for seeing me before I remembered how to see myself. Outside, the October night reclaimed him, but gently now. He was returning to the streets, but not as the same man who'd first sought shelter there. He was homeless still, but no longer lost. The city stretched before him, familiar and transformed. The new beginning. 6 weeks later, Marcus stood in the same downtown library where he'd once sought refuge from Portland's winter. But this time, he wasn't hiding. Spread across the table before him were newspaper clippings, legal documents, and letters, a paper trail documenting the aftermath of that October night that had changed everything. Art trafficking ring exposed, stolen masterpieces worth $500 million recovered. The headlines told only part of the story. They couldn't capture Elena Vasquez's tears when the FBI returned her grandmother's photograph, or the quiet dignity of the warehouse technicians testifying about their unwitting participation in something larger than they'd understood. They couldn't measure the weight of choices made in moments when principle collided with survival. Dr. Thorne? Marcus looked up to see a young woman with a briefcase and nervous energy. I'm Sarah Kim from the U.S. Attorney's Office. We spoke on the phone? He nodded, closing the newspaper. The federal case was moving forward, and his testimony would be crucial. But more than that, the government was offering him something he hadn't yet expected, a consulting position with the FBI's art crime team. Legitimate work, using his expertise to identify stolen pieces and trace their origins. A chance to rebuild not just his career, but his purpose. The position would start slowly, Sarah explained, settling into the chair across from him. Part-time consulting while you establish stability, but Agent Morrison believes your experience, both professional and personal, gives you insights others lack. Marcus thought about those insights, earned through nights in shelters and conversations with Rebecca Chen, through learning that societies discarded often saw truths that its comfortable citizens missed. What kind of work? Authentication primarily, but also investigation, talking to sources who might not trust traditional law enforcement. Sarah's tone suggested she understood what she was really asking. People who exist on the margins, who might recognize you as someone who's been where they are. The irony wasn't lost on him. His fall from grace, the months of homelessness that had stripped away his professional identity, had become qualifications for work he'd never imagined. The streets had taught him languages he hadn't known he needed to learn. There's housing assistance available, Sarah continued. Temporary at first, but... I've found a place, Marcus interrupted, surprising himself with the words. But as he said them, he realized they were true. Rebecca Chen has a spare room above her bookshop. She's offered it in exchange for help cataloging rare manuscripts. It wasn't charity, and it wasn't a return to his former life. It was something new. Partnership with someone who saw value in both his expertise and his experience, who understood that transformation required time to solidify. After Sarah left with his tentative acceptance, Marcus walked the familiar streets with different eyes. The shelter where he'd learned humility still operated, but now he saw it as part of a community rather than a last resort. The soup kitchen where he'd discovered that hunger was more than physical still served meals, but now he understood it as a place where dignity could be preserved even in desperation. At Chen's Rare Books, he found Rebecca arranging a new display, books about art recovery and cultural preservation, arranged alongside photos from the warehouse raid and information about families still searching for lost heritage. Making it real, she said when she saw him studying the display. Making sure people understand what was at stake. Marcus picked up a letter from Elena Vasquez, thanking him for choosing truth over comfort. Her grandmother's painting would eventually hang in a museum, with full documentation of its journey from family treasure to Nazi loot to federal evidence to rightful recognition. The story would be complete, honest, messy with human complexity. The FBI offered me work, he told Rebecca. Good work? Important work. Using what I learned out here to help people like Elena's family. He met her eyes, using what you taught me about seeing worth in what others discard. That evening, Marcus climbed the narrow stairs to the small room above the bookshop that would be his first permanent address in months. It wasn't much, a bed, a desk, shelves for the books he might someday own again, but it felt solid in a way that the warehouse's luxury never had. From his window, he could see the streets that had been his world, the corners where he'd learned that identity could survive the loss of everything else. He could see the library where he'd planned his choice, the coffee shop where Rebecca had first seen him as more than his circumstances. Tomorrow, he would begin work that mattered, using expertise earned through both education and exile. He would help families reclaim their heritage, help investigators understand the human cost of cultural theft. He would build something honest from the wreckage of his former life. But tonight, Marcus simply stood at his window, watching Portland's winter settle over streets that had taught him the difference between being lost and being found. He was no longer homeless, but he carried the lessons of homelessness with him. He was no longer the man who had chosen comfort over truth, but neither was he simply returning to who he'd been before. He was someone new, a bridge between worlds, a translator of experiences that society preferred to ignore, a guardian of truths that mattered more than comfort. The city lights stretched before him, no longer foreign territory but home, complex, difficult, beautiful home, where transformation was always possible and dignity could be discovered in the most unexpected places. Marcus smiled, understanding finally that this was what redemption looked like, not a return to the past, but a step toward a future worth building.